All right, welcome everyone. Um, I here we go. Welcome everyone. This is the MNSTAC October Forum. My name is Sonia Tostison. I'm with the University of Minnesota's Urban Forestry Outreach and Research Lab, and also with the MNSTAC committee, who hosts these monthly forums. And I have a few folks with me. Shane and Rachel and Mark are here today. We also have Megan and a great team. O'Brien, obviously, yeah, here too. And so we welcome. This is the free monthly forums we give out to anyone interested in trees with the opportunity to learn about new research projects, organizations, and ideas. So we also have a weekly newsletter, which we'll be sharing in a link to that in the chat. That has a lot of great events, trivia, job openings, news articles, and research, and many more things. So today's presentation is going to go over one of the hot topics of the fall, buckthorn. Woo woo! So we have Mike Schuster here, who is a researcher with the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources and also teaches as an assistant professor with Hamline. We'll dive into a lot of buckthorn overview and management. If you have questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A. If you can do the Q&A, that's great. I know sometimes it just slips our mind and we put them in the chat, so we'll be monitoring both of those. And we'll hopefully have time at the end of the forum to address those. And then we're also recording this forum, and it'll be posted to the MNSTAC playlist on our YouTube page. For those of you who are ISA certified and are looking for CEUs, this is worth 1.0 CEUs. I love decimals. Anywho, we will be posting the link to that Google form where you can put your information in at the end of the forum. All right, well, without further ado, Mike, you can take back the presentation and we'll get your screen shared.
There we go.
Okay. Yep, you look good.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So thanks everyone for being here today. I am a researcher at the University of Minnesota, and for about the past 9 years or so, we've been doing a series of projects that we call Cover It Up that looks at using native plant species to help increase biotic resistance and suppress invasion of buckthorn, but also broadly invasive woody species. And so a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are true for buckthorn explicitly, but you could also take away some lessons for other invasives as well. And of course, I'm going to give you a plug right up front. This is our website, coveredup.umn.edu. Everything that I'm going to talk about today, including seed mixes, experimental sites, project descriptions, all this stuff, papers, recordings, everything is on this website. So if you need to bail out at some point, or you are curious about something later on, check this out. It's all there. We try to make it as easy as possible for you to access. So that resource is available to you. And of course, I want to recognize our giant network of partners. I'm the one giving the talk, but really this is something that is made possible by a massive coalition of private, public, NGO, tribal organizations throughout the state. And we wouldn't be able to learn what we've learned without this being a collaborative effort. So some of you might be in the webinar right now. Thank you. We're always looking for new partners to continue to learn new and impactful things about buckthorn management. All right, so as many of you probably know, we have two different types of invasive buckthorn in Minnesota. We have common buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica. That's the main species that we focused on in this work, but a lot of it will also apply to Frangula alnus, glossy buckthorn. There are differences in their niche and how they grow, but a lot of the same types of traits that we associate with buckthorn invasions, we also see with glossy buckthorn. And so you can take away a lot of these messages for glossy buckthorn management as well. And the thing about these species, of course, is that they are massive headaches. They were both introduced in the 1800s as a ornamental hedge plant, and they're really good at those at those things. They grow really fast, they produce dense foliage, they hold their leaves late into winter, they produce tons of fruit that, looks pretty nice, and they're tolerant of deer browse or pruning. And so these are tremendously positive attributes in the context of a plant that you want to form a hedge. But when we translate them into natural areas, they become extremely problematic and force out native species. So this is a picture of me going down a trail, or what used to be a trail, and I can barely squeeze through it. And of course, this is kind of a best case scenario with buckthorn invasion, that there's actually a trail that I can take, right? Most sites that are invaded by buckthorn at this density are things where you have to get on your hands and knees to crawl through, or hack and slash your way through it. So these are extremely dense stands that are made possible by the suite of traits that these plants possess, and those traits mean that buckthorn has some pretty profound impacts on our ecosystems. Um, and those impacts are far reaching. They cover a ton of different bases. Of course, the thing that we immediately think of is the exclusion of native plant species, but we also have tack-on effects of that. Things like arrested forest succession, right? If buckthorn is taking over the understory, we don't get the replacement of canopy trees that we might expect. We get reduced timber production. This is a massive issue, especially in the northern part of the state, where we're seeing suppression of timber species and the replacement of those timber stands by buckthorn monocultures. We also see reduced value of landscapes to wildlife, right? Buckthorn is not a preferred habitat type for, for most species, and the types of forage that it produces, things like berries, are generally of lower quality compared to what these species have evolved to utilize. The dominance of buckthorn in ecosystems uh, has profound effects on nutrient cycling and fire dynamics. For example, the leaf litter that buckthorn produces decomposes really quickly, and so it's very challenging to get a prescribed fire through anywhere that's dominated by buckthorn. Uh, we have increased erosion and consequently lower water quality in watersheds invaded by buckthorn because there's nothing there to hold the soil. And of course, this is a positive feedback loop as well with invasive earthworms that further degrade our soils and promote invasive success, including that of buckthorn. And then we also have buckthorn as a host for agricultural pests like soybean aphid or oak crown rust. And forests invaded by buckthorn are just not fun. they don't do anything. And so most of this you're all intimately aware of, but I just want to put a really fine point on it, that these are really broad impacts, and all of these impacts accumulate in a way that makes buckthorn management a very real and persistent problem that has real impacts on our natural communities, but also our people communities. And so there's a big incentive for us to manage this effectively. The ways that we do that currently or conventionally are pretty broad as well. It ranges from things like uprooting, which is probably the only guaranteed way to kill a plant, right? Is if you rip it out of the ground, it's going to die. But that's extremely labor intensive. We can do things like cut and treat or hack and squirt. We can use forestry mowers. These are all versions of physical removal. We often pair them with follow-up options like foliar herbicide, or using livestock, or in more open places, getting a fire through if there's sufficient cover. But when we are undertaking these different management options, um, there's a few different things we might want to think about. And depending on your scale, we have to be really realistic with our goals and expectations, right? It's far better to manage a small area well than a large area poorly. And what I mean by that is if we have limited resources, which we always do, we want to invest those in a way that is going to not make a little impact over a broad area, but a big impact in a small area, relatively. And the reasons for that, we'll talk about in a little bit, but basically, if we have a limited amount of resources, then we want to prevent ourselves from having to just keep spending those resources over and over and over again. And we also need to be realistic about what we can do, right? There's no perfect approach. Every approach has strengths and weaknesses. And there are no silver bullets. And so we often need to use combinations of these different approaches to get the best results. And so I'm going to be talking about revegetation as well as a few other approaches today. But none of these, even the ones I'm talking about and kind of endorsing here, are ones that are silver bullets. And I want to be super clear about that there's always going to be a need for additional follow-up and monitoring. One management thing that we've been looking at more intensely recently is this idea of critical period cutting. You might have heard of this. I feel like it's gotten a little bit of attention within the state recently. Um, and basically, the idea of critical period cutting is that we essentially starve the plant of carbon over the course of a couple years. It starts off by high topping the plant in June, so cutting, at about chest height. This is a picture of a plant that's been high topped, and then allowing that plant to resprout, to put out new growth, and then repeatedly stripping that regrowth back. So cut it in June, rip it off in September, rip it off again then the following June, and then rip it off the following September. And over that process, we gradually starve the plant of carbon and ultimately kill it. And so we've been doing a field experiment on this to test, hey, does this work? What are the conditions in which it works? Are bigger plants more resistant to it? Are plants in higher light conditions more resistant to it? What is the efficacy of this treatment? And now we're at the end of our second year. We just wrapped up our October treatment for the second year. And over this 2-year period, we have about 75% mortality of buckthorn stems treated in Minnesota. And this is preliminary data. This is stuff that, is hot off the presses. Well, not even on the presses, right? Fresh off the clipboard. And it's an ongoing collaboration with people across multiple different states and kind of the northern US. But at least for our stems in Minnesota here, we have pretty decent efficacy of this treatment. We're still trying to figure out the details about, if size and context matters and to what extent, but, broad strokes here, looking at stems that were grown in really diverse light conditions that range from pencil size to, like a foot, 2 foot in diameter, they're like really giant stems. We have about that 75% mortality, which is encouraging. And the reason why that's encouraging is because this is a low disturbance and non-chemical option. It's ideal for volunteer groups, right? We don't need to have any type of specialized training or equipment. Basically, anyone can go through the woods and pull resprouts off of, or green tissue off of stems, and it's something that we can do that requires labor, but not a lot of capital investment, and that's something that we generally find works out very well for community groups and volunteer groups that otherwise wouldn't have access to those types of equipment or capital. Basically, the way this works is, as I said, playing with the carbon budget of the plant. So under normal growing conditions, we generally see plants have higher carbon inputs, like through photosynthesis, than they do outputs. Carbon outputs being things like growth or maintenance. And so in the winter time, plants buckthorn are coming out of winter with some reserves. That's what this little battery here is, their carbon reserves. They have some carbon reserves that they've used to survive the winter. Coming into spring here, they mobilize those reserves and, not deplete them totally, but certainly draw them down in order to put out new leaves, new growth in the spring. And then over the summer, they replenish those reserves through photosynthesis. And in the fall, when they senesce, they pull back some of that carbon, but generally have a full tank going into winter that they then draw down over the winter and mobilize in the spring. So that's like the status quo. But with critical period cutting, we move to a paradigm something like this, where we shift carbon inputs through photosynthesis to be less than carbon outputs, thereby depleting the carbon reserves of the plant. So we go through the same process of, coming out of winter, mobilizing our carbon reserves to grow new leaves. But with critical period cutting, we say, hey, I'm going to take all that carbon that you just mobilized and you're not going to get anything for it. I'm going to cut all that new growth off. And so you end up with a battery that's still really low. You have really low carbon reserves. It mobilizes a little bit of what it has left in order to regrow. And we say, hey, that's mine again too. You get nothing for this. And we repeat this process every June and September until the plant dies. And that's how critical period cutting works. And like I said, it seems to be working in a lot of cases, for us at least. And whether you're doing critical period cutting or other types of conventional management, you likely will want to make some prioritizations regarding the size of the stems that you treat. Of course, our goal is to remove as many buckthorn as possible, all the buckthorn, if I could say so. But we want to remove both big stems and small stems. But if you are looking at a low intensity initial pass to just kind of like stage up your main management, you might consider removing just fruiting trees. Now that's easier said than done, of course, because many fruiting trees might be hard to identify in the midst of a giant buckthorn thicket, and plants that are fruiting now or aren't fruiting now might fruit next year or something like that, right? And so this is a pretty loose determination. But if we can go through and remove at least the big obvious fruiters, those seeds will germinate pretty quickly within the next couple of years, primarily in the next year. And we can utilize shading from the other remaining plants to suppress that germination or suppress that establishment. And so those plants can help us kind of cut down on the propagules pressure, cut down on the total amount of invasion that we have to deal with in the subsequent years. And we know that from some early work we did looking at buckthorn survival rates or seedling survival rates relative to canopy openness. So this is a graph looking at 3-year survival rate of seedlings relative to canopy openness, basically how much light you would see if you look up in the sky. And you can see that buckthorn really doesn't care once you get above 10% canopy openness. But when you're below 10% canopy openness, survival tends to start declining. And once you get down to 2% light availability, which sounds really low, but is achievable, that's when you really see low buckthorn survival rates. And it turns out that if we look under these buckthorn thickets, that 3 or 2% light availability is really where those conditions are. So we can see really low survival of buckthorn seedlings under adjacent buckthorn because of this. And so we can leverage that to our advantage and try to keep the total amount of buckthorn popping up down. Regardless of what method we use, whether it's critical period cutting, whether it's cut and treat, whether it's something else, whatever we do, it's not going to be perfect, right? Removal efforts are, I say almost, that's being gracious. They're always incomplete, right? And that means that we have to deal with lots of different pathways through which buckthorn can reestablish itself. one of those is just resprouts from damaged stems. So if we put a forestry mower through there, let's say, we're going to end up with tons of little stems that look like this on the top image. See all sorts of little whips coming up from that damaged stem. Right? Buckthorn is a prolific resprouter, and so it's like a mythological hydra. You cut off one stem and you get 10 stems in its place, making it much more challenging to deal with. So we have to deal with those resprouts. We also have to deal with small buckthorn that escape treatment. A lot of times we're writing management plans to treat buckthorn that are, only 3 feet or taller. Well, that leaves all those little stems, you know, laying in wait to reestablish the population. And so those small buckthorn that escape treatment, either on, by design or, we are human, we miss things. Those are things that we do have to deal with eventually. And then new buckthorn that come through seed banks or dispersal can kind of create these chia pets, these carpets of seedlings that we also have to deal with. And so these three pathways of reestablishment mean that most buckthorn stands require repeat treatment within just a few years. Right? This is a site out in Marine on St. Croix where we went through with a forestry mower, and this is what it looks like 2 years later. There's no follow-up treatment, so everything that was there just regrew. And you can see, this is my collaborator Peter Ragg, and pretty much everything you see around him is buckthorn, and it's taller than he is already, just within a couple of years. And so the clear thing there is that resprouts are the immediate challenge that we need to deal with. If we leave those resprouts alone, they will quickly reclaim dominance. And so, another example here, this is a site down in Victoria. I'm a little bit over 6 feet tall. This is a buckthorn resprout from earlier that year that is just as tall as I am. And so this is from a stem that we would call a Moab, a mother of all buckthorn, just a giant tree. And so it had tons of carbon reserves that it could mobilize to put this growth up very quickly. But still, like 6 feet of resprout in a couple months is, it's wild. There's nothing that we could plant that would compete against that, right? So we need to do something about that in order to kind of stop this perpetual cycle of buckthorn reestablishment. One thing that we can do, of course, is herbicides. We've had very good luck with a foliar herbicide that's a bud inhibitor called phosphamine ammonium. It's a fairly unconventional herbicide to use. Most people would use a triclopyr product, and those are effective tools. But of course, there are more and more places where people are either herbicide hesitant or explicitly prohibited from using herbicides, and so maybe we're looking at just repeat mechanical removal, like through critical period cutting is another way that we can do that. And so then we're left with those little guys, right? If we come up with a plan to deal with the big guys, that leaves the little guys. And the little guys, can be, a different beast to deal with because of how small they are and how many there are, right? Some of the things that we're going to use on big stems work much better for big stems and don't work very well for little stems, and vice versa. They require different management approaches at times. And so these small buckthorn really do represent an ongoing challenge over a broader timeline compared to those resprouts, which are right there right away. We need to deal with them fast. But those little guys, those are the long-term, more sinister threats. We're getting into Halloween time, right? They're spooky like that. Anyway, so the little buckthorn can take advantage of the conditions that we create through our management. This is probably a very familiar site to most of you, where on the left we have a stand of unmanaged buckthorn, and on the right we have an area of that same stand that's had buckthorn removed by cut and treat. And of course, this is a property line, right? So the property owner on the left did not manage, the property owner on the right did. And you can see the difference in conditions created by buckthorn removal. One of the things, of course, that stands out is that there's basically nothing left in the understory on the right. And That means that there's very low competition for resources on the right, especially things like light. And we know that buckthorn responds in this kind of nonlinear way to light availability, but especially in the fall, where fall light availability really is a key asset for small buckthorn looking to survive the winter. So they need that fall light availability. And while we don't have, much native many native species here or really anything to compete against the buckthorn. There's tons of buckthorn propagules here, right? There's all those little guys that we left behind. There's all the seeds that are left behind from our management. And those seeds exploit this opportunity going from a condition down here, right, where we had those co-occurring buckthorn shading out our baby buckthorn up to a condition something like this, where there's 20% light availability on the right side of this image. And you can see how massive of an impact that has on the survival rate of those small buckthorn. That by opening up the canopy here, we've provided those little buckthorn with everything they could ever ask for in terms of resource availability. And if nothing left to compete against them, it shouldn't be a surprise that buckthorn takes back over. And so our work has largely focused on how we can prevent that from happening through the use of native plants. If the problem is competition, well, let's reintroduce competition. And we have a series of papers, a series of experiments that have looked at this, and the story is very consistent that reestablishing native plant cover quickly and densely after management vastly improves management outcomes. Um, those native species that we reestablish compete for light and other resources against those small buckthorn, especially in the fall when those plants need light the most. And so we see very reliable but variable impacts of these revegetation treatments across diverse contexts. We've done experiments in a variety of different forest types with different canopy opennesses, with different revegetation methods, with different species, and the impacts are reliable, but as I say, variable, ranging from on average 50 to 90% reduction in buckthorn invasion over the next few years, depending on the method and experiment. And some of the big kind of poster plants that we see for this are things like wild ryegrasses, the limus species. You can also throw bottle brush grass in there, which I think used to be a limus and now it's its own gene, it's now hystrix or whatever. Um, these wild rye type grasses, these cool season understory adapted species can produce really dense layers of vegetation. And that vegetation, even though the plant senesce, pretty early in the fall, that vegetation still shades out buckthorn in the fall by creating this thatchy layer. Right, that thatchy layer shades the little buckthorn. Even though the plant itself isn't photosynthesizing, all it needs to do is shade, and it can do that in the fall. Same thing with elderberry. So elderberry is one of the few native deciduous species that shares a very similar leaf phenology to buckthorn. So red elderberry especially will put leaves out, and yes, they'll senesce, but they'll maintain on the plant in a way that allows it to shade out little buckthorn underneath. And red elderberry grows pretty quickly and has these really, big broad compound leaves. So it's both of these species or groups of species are very well adapted to compete against buckthorn, and we've seen them do so repeatedly in our experiments. We also see add-on effects of this restoration method, right? By reestablishing these native plant layers, we are restoring biodiversity and function to these systems. For example, by reestablishing a diverse community of grasses and forbs, we see improved pollinator habitat. Notably, that's the forbs doing the work there, but we see improved pollinator habitat, particularly of things like rusty patch bumblebee preferred species. We see greater floral area in our restoration areas where we seeded because we put those species there, right? So we have some ability to influence not just buckthorn suppression, but also these other ecosystem attributes, including things like nutrient cycling and erosion. For example, I have a student that's working on a paper right now where she found that revegetating helps stabilize nutrient cycling. It kind of broke some of these positive feedback loops that we would normally see with buckthorn invasion. And so that too is another example of an add-on effect that you know, that we get from this revegetation approach. But in order to be effective, that revegetation needs to happen very quickly and very heavily. So we generally recommend, or at least our experiments suggest, that revegetating alongside removal is really the way to go. And this is because with any type of management, we're going to have a bunch of seeds that are dropped on the ground. We're going to have all those little buckthorn that are released. And those seeds are almost always going to germinate within a year or maybe two of dispersal. And so 99% of seedlings are going to be on site within 2 years. And that means that almost every plant that we have to contend with going forward is present within that 2 year window post management. So the plants that we have to contend with are there. We just have to choose to act against them. And whatever we do, whatever actions we take are going to be most effective when those buckthorn are smallest. We've done some work looking at basically the chances of a buckthorn surviving from 0 to 1 year, 1 to 2 year, 2 to 3 years, and so on. And the chances of survival are very low in the first year and the second year. But by the time they get to 3 years old, they're pretty well established and robust. So if we're going to outcompete them, our best chances are when we do that in the first couple years of life. And this means that we need to have dense cover established very quickly after management, ideally in the summer following management, if we're doing management like in the fall, winter, spring. And so what's worked in our experiments has, doing winter seeding. So we do snow seeding with grasses and forbs, throwing that on top of snowpack. That has a couple advantages in terms of improving seed soil contact and stuff, but also makes it just a lot easier to see where you put the seed, which is again a big asset if we're trying to make sure that we have dense coverage throughout a management area. For shrubs or bare root plants, we're doing spring planting. So we're getting the plants out there as quickly as we can to make sure that they are there to compete against the buckthorn when it is going to be most effective. And these are things that, yes, can be done by crews and contractors, but also can be good volunteer activities. So like in the upper right hand of the screen, you see a picture of a child spreading seed. This is adorable, but also something that Sally Manzar Nature Center out in Lake Elmo does as part of their management, is they have volunteer opportunities where people come out and spreads native plant seed. You probably want to combine this with more traditional application of seed, but why not, right? And then below is a picture of a student group that I led that went out and planted trees for one of our experiments, right? So you can have volunteer opportunities to help make these things a little bit more feasible too. Oop, there we go. Um, and so you have a couple different choices that you can make about how you want to do this revegetation. Certainly the most cost-effective, or at least the most accessible version of this, is seeding grasses and wildflowers. It's very practical. There are commercial mixes, like canned mixes, that you can already use. For example, I just saw Prairie Restoration came out with a what they call it, like Battle of the Buckthorn mix or something. Minnesota Native Landscapes, formerly Minnesota Native Landscapes, now MNL, has a buckthorn replacement mix as well. And so there are multiple different commercial mixes that you can access if you're looking for a canned option. Otherwise, you can always build your own based on the work that we've done or something else, right? And those are um, those are all mixes that kind of share a common theme of having a lot of these wild rye species in them. So Canada, Virginia, silky wild rye are good species to use for this because they're adapted for woodlands that have at least 10% light availability. They're fast growing, they're quickly established, and again, they leave that thatchy layer in the fall that can shade young buckthorn when they're most vulnerable. And we've found that around 600 seeds per square meter is about where our mixes have been effective. There's probably you can probably get away with less than that. We just don't have. We're still working on the dosing sensitivity for this, the seed rate sensitivity for this. So that's actually an ongoing experiment that we have, is looking at, do you need 600? Can it be 500, 400? Where do you need to be? So we're still working on that. But 600 has worked for us. And across those experiments, we found that seeding works best in brighter sites that were more open. So on the left here, you see a graph showing herbaceous cover versus canopy openness for seeded plots, seeded areas in green and unseeded areas in black. And what you'll see is that yes, on average, seeding increased herbaceous cover, but that was particularly true the more light you had. That more light fed into this effect more and more. And of course, this had impact on the amount of light available to baby buckthorn as well, in kind of the opposite way, right? That more herbaceous cover meant less light getting to the baby buckthorn. So ground level light availability on the right here, same scheme and everything like that. You see the green line is below the black line, and especially in highlight areas. So seeding is more effective in those brighter areas because it soaks up more and more of the light. And of course, this has impacts on those baby buckthorn as well. So this is again the same type of graph where green is seeded and black is unseeded, looking at the total amount of buckthorn biomass that you get in the total amount of buckthorn biomass you get relative to canopy openness. And you'll see that at like 20% canopy openness, we had about a 90% reduction in buckthorn biomass in total invasion. Whereas at something like 7% canopy openness, something that looks like this image on the left, we had still a respectable 60% decrease. But it's not 90%, right? 90%, that happened in those really highlight woodlands situations, whereas a more forested condition, we had a lesser, but still positive impact. And this work is supported by our network of participatory or citizen scientists. So we did an experiment across the state with more than 120 different participants that replicated this exact approach across the state. And we found that, yes, the story is true there as well, that we see seeding herbaceous species suppresses buckthorn in diverse contexts, and it doesn't require intense management by a group of researchers or a bunch of specialists. It can be done by anyone. Alongside that, we also saw that wildflowers can build in kind of long-term value. And the reason for this is because the grasses, those wild rice species, tend to thin out after about 4 or 5 years. They start to self-thin a bit. And that is kind of perfect because a lot of the wildflower species we use, things like snakeroot or black-eyed Susan, waterleaf, bee balm, figwort, columbine, meadow rue, and so on, all those species take a few years to establish, right? And they start to really take off at about the same time that those grasses are thinning out. And so it's a built-in planned succession, that the succession into those forbs does help maintain cover and ecological function and resistance against invasion going forward. I also want to take a moment here to point out that we kind of have a risk and an opportunity in the state right now where, the spread of oak wilt and emerald ash borer are affecting canopy conditions in a way that likely are going to facilitate invasion, right? If we're opening up the canopy, that means that buckthorn are going to do better. Our data have shown that. But it also has shown that revegetation is more effective there too. So I think it's worth, in the back of your mind at least, thinking about how we might be able to proactively or like at least quickly respond to these changes in canopy conditions in a way that reduces invasion overall and maybe saves us some headache going forward, right? If we can get native species into these these newly formed canopy gaps early, they will be in a better position to resist invasion. Right. So that's with herbaceous seeding. But maybe you want to use woody plants, right? Woody plants are going to be better suited for darker sites. Uh, Shrubs can tolerate lower light levels than most grasses, let's say. And those woody species often are going to be better competitors against buckthorn because they're more functionally similar. They have similar structure, similar height. Things like elderberry and evergreens have um, niche overlap. They have that phenological overlap with buckthorn in a way that most other species don't. But the thing about woody species, of course, is that they have a very limited influence around each individual. If you have one plant, it can only affect the area around that one plant. And this is true, of course, for herbaceous species too, but you'd have so many more of the herbaceous species that this kind of is a moot point. But with woody species, we generally have fewer, and so they have a more limited zone of influence. And so we need a plant at very high densities in order to get decent establishment. In order to get decent establishment, we also have to protect against deer, which is a huge problem, a huge challenge, right? And so one thing that we're looking at in partnership with Shakopee and Waka and Sioux community is looking at how we can um, like what density we really need to plant these at. Do planting them at half a meter, is that what we really need to do, or can we get away with 1 meter or 2 meters or 5 meter spacing, something like that to get good cover. But if you do plant, you likely want to combine that with some of those earlier methods that we talked about, like with herbaceous seeding. We can also use woody seeds to help fill in the gaps too. Woody seed can be challenging to secure, right? There's a limited number of species that actually have commercially available seed. But of course, the DNR has the seed collection program, and we can always try to do some more volunteer stuff or self-sourcing of seeds. Our experiments have basically contracted out seed collection work where we've hired people to go out and just get seed for us. And that's how we've sourced some of our species. Um, and there's some benefits to this approach as well, that filling in areas with woody seed might provide some safety in numbers against herbivores, right? If you have a bunch of plants coming up in cohort, they're coming up in concert with each other, then you can kind of like spread out the herbivore damage a little bit. That's kind of an anecdotal observation from some of our experiments. But we found that woody seeding is able to generate an immense amount of cover with at least a little bit of deer mitigation. So we've used fences, but the fences are awful and are almost always down. So I would call that a deer reduced treatment instead of a deer absent treatment. But even under those conditions, we've had some pretty good establishment of woody species. And so that can be a useful tool for filling in those gaps between the bare root plants that you plant or the container raised plants that you plant. And then, of course, there's natural recruitment of woody species too. Buckthorn tends to co-occur with black cherry, for example, and in a lot of these sites, we have a lot of black cherry recruitment from from resprouts or from seed banks. And so those resprouts and seed banks of native species can help augment any type of management that you do. They can improve the baseline conditions so you don't have to plant as much in order to achieve a certain density of plants. And from work that we've done, using a combination of natural regeneration um, and planting, we found that the most important thing is just having native species there, right? That it doesn't matter if they were the ones that we planted or not, that total stem density was the thing that mattered. And more native species, more native stems meant less buckthorn stems. And this is um, a principal component analysis that basically shows you that the density of native stems is the thing that will shoot management areas in a different direction away from buckthorn dominance. And so we see that more natives means fewer invasives in general. It doesn't matter if you planted them or not. And then so we've talked about, some initial management that you've done. We've talked about seeding herbaceous species or getting woody species in there through a variety of different approaches. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, none of these are silver bullets. They will make things much easier, right? If we reduce the total amount of buckthorn in a woodland or forest, that means that there's less buckthorn for us to manage. And that saves us time, money, effort. Um, and that's, I think, a win. But there's still some buckthorn there, right? There's still something that we have to keep an eye out for. Um, but those limited number of buckthorn that we've found in our experiments have been much more vulnerable to intervention than buckthorn in the absence of revegetation. So these revegetation treatments leave some buckthorn behind, but they're weaker. They're smaller. They're more vulnerable to treatment. And so we can combine this with other management tools more effectively. We can use critical period cutting on some of these, smaller, more isolated stems than we would be able to do in the absence of revegetation. We can use triclopyr, right? Triclopyr is an herbicide that's generally grass friendly, and if we're using grasses to revegetate, that's probably a good thing, right? We don't want to kill the grasses, but we could spray triclopyr in a way that's going to hurt the remaining buckthorn, but leave the grassy layer intact, more or less. And then we also are producing a layer of fine fuel with revegetation. And that can allow us to get prescribed burns through systems that otherwise wouldn't have enough fine fuel. And those burns can, again, be another component of a multifaceted approach to manage buckthorn and restore ecosystem function. So we have multiple different benefits of revegetation and multiple different avenues for continued monitoring and follow-up that are made possible through that revegetation as well. Right, so in a nutshell, in a buckthorn fruit, right, establishing native species quickly after initial buckthorn management can reduce the total amount of buckthorn returning over multiple years. We've seen that consistently across our experiments, particularly things like wild ryegrasses and wildflowers in sites with, about 10% or more canopy openness are going to do a really good job. Planting shrubs, things like elderberry or trees can also suppress or eliminate buckthorn invasion if those are species that hold their leaves late into the fall. Um, Again, if you're interested in the specific seed mixes that we use or methods that we use, all that's available on our website. And yeah, you can also always email me directly, Schuster@umn.edu. Of course, this work is made possible by the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center with funding through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund as administered by the LCCMR. So thank you. I'm happy to have any conversation or questions with the time that we have left. Oops, Sonia, you're muted still.
I'll just do a little miming. Yeah, awesome. That was great. Thank you so much. I believe Shane was managing the Q&A. So Shane, take it away.
All right, we've got a number of questions here. I'll try to get through them quick. Um, so first up from Mark Chapin, with small buckthorn, has there been any success with taping the cut with duct tape? We've avoided some regrowth in our yard doing that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark. I have not tried that. Um, so my guess would be that this would be something where you're taping up the whole stem, kind of like a buckthorn baggie, or putting a can over it, something like that. And I would imagine that that would have comparable effects of just shape, basically preventing the plant from photosynthesizing effectively. And so in theory, I could see that working. But I haven't explored the duct tape uh, methodology yet. That's an interesting idea.
Excellent, thank you. Here's a quick one. Could you please repeat the name of the bud inhibitor herbicide that you've had luck with?
Oh yeah, so the bud inhibitor herbicide that we've used effectively is phosphamine ammonium. It goes by the brand name of Krenite. Um, yeah.
All right, thank you. What's the range of diameters that you would suggest for critical period cutting?
So again, this is still preliminary data, but so far it seems like the stem diameter isn't a huge determinant of method efficacy. And we did this on stems ranging from pencil size at chest height to, like I said, like more than a foot in diameter. So, um, yeah, I think the methodology, all plants need carbon, and if you can steal that away from them, they won't do very well, right? So I think the theory behind it holds across size classes. There's some reason to think that there might be nonlinear responses with size, that some size classes might be more sensitive than others, but we haven't dug that out of the data yet, or the data haven't been so forthcoming as to make that an obvious relationship
Hmm.
yet. So, not saying it doesn't exist, but we haven't seen it yet. So, stay tuned.
Great, thank you. There were several questions inquiring about seed mixes like the Battle of the Buckthorn seed mix from Prairie Moon Nursery. You did mention that those were products available. So,
Mhm.
um, do you also kind of endorse those mixes, or do you have any criticisms, or what are your thoughts on those pre-canned mixes?
I will not endorse nor deter people from using any of those mixes. Our data show that getting native species into buckthorn management areas is effective and valuable management approach. And so, however people want to do that, whether that's using canned mixes or not, I'm not going to really weigh in on. What I will say is that there are many similarities across these mixes. And I think the differences are probably relatively minor compared to the similarities.
Mm,
Um, I don't have an overwhelming set of evidence to suggest that the specific tailoring of these mixes is going to be the thing. It's mostly that they have a large component of wild ryegrasses, and all the mixes do. So
It's a
that's the thing.
perfect segue to some questions about wild rye grasses.
Hmm.
One, are they viable to plant in northern Minnesota? And when you've got the seeds and you're sowing them, can they be sowed directly on the ground, or do they need to be lightly tilled into the soil?
Great question. So yes, they can grow in northern Minnesota. What tends to there used there may be environmental covariates with latitude that predisposition some sites to be more grass friendly than others. So things like soil texture, for example. Um, those are things that might be an obstacle. But but yes, they can grow in northern Minnesota. And the other question was, on that note, I'll say for our citizen science network, where we had sites throughout the state, and if you go back to that slide, you'll see that the sites that I showed on that slide are largely contained within the kind of lower 2/3 of the state. But we did have sites farther north too that just weren't included in the data set that went into that image. And in those analysis, what we found was that the biggest thing was not latitude, but just ambient grass cover. So places that had
Mhm.
more grasses ambiently didn't benefit as much from a grass heavy seed mix. I think that's intuitive. And places that had less grasses, ambiently benefited more from a seed mix. And so we saw that seeding did have differential effects throughout the state, but that was almost entirely associated with canopy openness and ambient vegetation. The other part of the question was about sowing, and we've had really good results with just broadcast seeding with no tilling or any type of special pre-treatment to the sites. So when we are sowing onto snowpack, that I think that tends to help the seed get into the soil, because as the seed, as the snow melts, it kind of wiggles it down through the litter layer, and then you also have like good soil moisture at that time, and this is kind of like it's a good setup for the seed. But we haven't had to rake or anything. And even forestry mowing mulch hasn't been a major obstacle, except for when it gets really thick, right? If you get like 4 inches of mulch, then that's a problem. But
Mhm.
the more pervasive conditions of scattered mulch, an inch or two of mulch, that's the seeds have worked well in those conditions.
Excellent. Thanks. So we've got a few left here, but not much time. So I'll say to anyone, if you've got questions that were unanswered or more questions, again, email address is just Schuster, SCHUSTER @UMN.edu. But I'll ask another quickly here. Grace asks, do you prefer the more solid plastic grow tubes or the plastic mesh ones for seedlings? Do you notice one or the other having better success?
Yeah, so the mesh tubes are a pain for me. I have not had good success with those because they just lack integrity, like they lack structural integrity that I think that would be helpful. So the plastic mesh tubes have not worked well for me. The solid plastic tubes have worked better because of that. So that's what I'll say.
I'll try to squeeze in one
Yeah.
more. In forestry restoration work, are there disadvantages to introducing aggressive native species after initial buckthorn removal? Which is to say, are we negatively impacting biodiversity by emphasizing aggressive native monocultures to the understory restoration?
I think that's a really important question, but also a very broad question. And so the true answer, and the answer that you always get with ecology, is it depends. Depends on the species. And so I I would tend to say, if we're going to be painting in broad strokes here, that I would prefer as an individual to have an ecosystem dominated by aggressive ruderal, let's say, natives than that actually, I could walk through, for example, than a than buckthorn, right? So, if I have to, pick one of those, I'm going to pick the native dominated understory. But I don't think that that's a choice that we would have to make as often as we might think. I think you can have your cake and eat it too. And I think the wild rice species are an example of that, right? That they are self-thinning after several years. There are natural processes like accumulation of pathogens or herbivory that help transition these seemingly low diversity states into more diverse ones through natural processes. And so I don't, our work hasn't shown that any of the methods that we have used have created monocultures to the extent that they would be worse than a buckthorn monoculture.
Great. Thank you so much. There are so many good questions. I'm going to put it in the chat again. I'll say it again. Schuster at umn.edu. There's a lot of questions out there about buckthorn. So thank you for taking the time to answer those. And Sonia, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for being here today and a great presentation. I learned a couple new things and got excited about buckthorn, which is weird to say. And we did put a link to the ISACU CEU in the chat. So please submit your information there. Our next forum will be and December 18th. So that's a Thursday for our holiday forum. We don't have one in November because of the Partners in Community Forestry Conference. And we will record or put the recording of this webinar up on our YouTube MNSTAC page. So thank you to you, Mike. Thank you to the MNSTAC team and to all of you attendees for coming out today. Thank you very much. Keep it treesy.